But it means that if you were to say, what does Christianity look like in the first century, in the second century, in the third century, in the fourth century? Correct. You would come away saying it looks like the Catholic Church. They worship like the Catholics. They believe what Catholics believe. They call themselves the Catholic Church. They, like this is pretty clearly the same institution.
What exactly is that term argument from silence? I think you touched on it already, but for the sake of our listeners, what is it and why is it invalid?
Yeah, so the argument from silence is, you can't prove that they didn't believe this. So, you can say, oh, look at all these people who believe Catholic things. But if I'm a Baptist, I might say, oh, well, maybe there were a lot of people who believed Baptist things and you can't prove otherwise. And that's a really weak kind of argument. And I argue in the book that you could argue it the other way as well, that we find several areas where early Christians get in conflict with one another. And so if you see no conflict on it, if you see something like someone is saying the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist is true, the Eucharist is Jesus, or they're saying you need a bishop to have a church, or they're saying there are 4 gospels, or they're saying baptism forgives your sins and makes you a child of God. If they're saying these things and no one responds to that and no one argues against them, the best understanding is that probably means people agreed with them, especially when their texts are copied and they're revered and their saint days are celebrated in the church after they die. And, they're treated as saints. They're treated as theologians that we need to listen to and follow. They're treated as church fathers, even within early Christianity. That's a really good indication that they are representing something more than their own views. So if you're going to make the argument from silence, we should expect to see outcry if people are saying heretical things. And I give the example, there's a Protestant university in the US, Regent University. You can, take any example you want. If Pat Robertson, the Protestant televangelist, got up and said, from now on, we're not going to have Protestant services in the chapel, we're going to have the Catholic Mass. And by the way, this is the true sacrifice of Jesus' flesh and blood to the Father. And don't forget to submit to your bishop, because without the bishop, there is no church. Would the students remain silent? Would the faculty remain silent? Would people just quietly accept this and move on with their lives? Of course not. There'd be a tremendous outcry. You would find a great evidence of there being conflict. You'd find people, trying to oust him as president. You'd find people leaving the university. You'd find, real battles. And we find nothing like this. We find all those things I just mentioned. We find people saying those things in the early church. And yet we find no one fighting against that any of us would consider Christian. In other words, the only people we find fighting against that are like the Gnostics, who don't believe the incarnation even happened. Yeah. Like if you're a Protestant, you don't want them to be the guys in your corner because you don't recognize them as Christian.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's a good way of turning around that question that seems to engage Catholics when in fact it's something that's actually self-defeating. So thank you for that, Joe.
In the book, I think you called it when the dog didn't bark.
Yes, so it's a reference to Sherlock Holmes. And so there's this story called Silver Blaze. And in it, Sherlock Holmes points out the curious incident of the dog in the nighttime. And the idea is that there'd been a break-in and the dog did nothing in the nighttime. And he said, that's the curious incident. Like, why didn't the dog bark? Well, he didn't bark because he knew the guy who broke in. And this is like the big kind of breakthrough in the case. So likewise, if Christians don't bark at the teaching, if we don't see the Christian doctrinal watchdogs barking, well, they must know the teaching. They must know the teacher. They must recognize it as orthodox.
Nice. Yes. Well, one final question. What other Catholic doctrine that are not covered in the book could also be proven by the early church history? Like, for instance, some Marian
That's a good doctrines. Question. There's a lot of things. I mean, in the U.S., there's some people who argue that homosexuality might be acceptable within Catholicism. Very clearly, you can't read the early Christians and come away with that idea. Or even the issue of abortion, the Didache I mentioned earlier, forbids abortion. You find Christians talking about abortion and infanticide as being serious sins as far back as we find any kind of writing on them at all. And so you could look at those sorts of issues very clearly. I mentioned the 4 Gospels in the book. We didn't really cover that here, but the fact that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are the Gospels.
Yes.
And it's kind of, I have some fun with that because I think most Protestants would say you have to believe that. if you're going to be a Christian. But if you say, well, how do you know there are 4 gospels?
Correct.
Well, it turns out you get it from Irenaeus, who you think is a heretic. And so that's weird. So those kind of issues